Welcome to the online study of Genesis. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Charlie Walden, and yes, I did get a haircut. This is a study originally planned for April, but then the coronavirus pandemic kind of got in the way, so we're trying something a little different, something I haven't done before certainly, and there's certainly every possibility that we may change some things before we're through with this. Now let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of the class and what we're going to do right now, how this is supposed to work. So once a week, early in the week, we will post a new pre-recorded session of the study on Northgate's website. Each session will be about 30 to 40 minutes in length. Generally should be available by Monday morning. Can't promise it'll always be there. And you can watch it any time during the week that is convenient for you. On Wednesdays, at 6:30 p.m. there will be a follow-up Zoom discussion session where we can discuss the current week's study. So if you've signed up for the follow-up Zoom session already, we'll send you the instructions on how to connect to that session. If you haven't used Zoom before, it's really not too difficult. All you need is a computer or a tablet or an iPad or a phone with a camera on it and internet access. So you can just call it, or you can just call into the phone number provided and just listen if you want to, listen and talk. So the discussion session is for anyone who has questions about some of the material covered in the week's lesson, or has some ideas you want to talk about, or you just want to listen to the discussion. I'll have a couple of set questions to get us started. So I would expect this Wednesday session should also be about a half an hour, maybe a little bit longer. You do need to sign up in advance to participate in the follow-up Zoom session. You cannot connect to the Zoom session until we send you the link and passcode. So if you haven't signed up yet, you won't get those. So if you haven't signed up yet, you may send an email to genesis.online@northgateumc.org and say you want to participate in the Wednesday discussion session of the Genesis study. So that again is genesis.online@northgateumc.org. So this is a class on the book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible. So it'll be useful for you to have a copy of the Bible with you as we go along. We're going to read the book of Genesis. If you have more than one Bible, we'll talk later about what specific translation might work a little bit better, but any Bible will work. A word of warning here at this point. This is going to be a long introduction. So we will actually get to the Genesis today and actually read about God creating the heavens and the earth, but we've got some other stuff to go through first. So hang in there. We need to first talk about the mechanics of the course or our objectives. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of translation in reading the Bible, and particularly in reading Genesis. We'll also do a quick overview of the book of Genesis before we get started actually reading from this book. Primary text that I'm going to be using is the 5 Books of Moses by Robert Alter. This is a translation and commentary, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is my primary source. You do not need to buy that book. You can certainly use whatever Bible you have. So let's open with a word of prayer. Oh God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So, a little bit about the rules of the class. There aren't a lot of rules. Certainly this portion, the rules are you watch it or you don't watch it. Turn it off. The follow-up session, the primary rules are respect other people on the call. If you're new to Zoom, learn where the mute button is. When you're not talking, leave it on mute. Now when you want to talk, take your computer off of mute. If there are only a handful of people on the call, we won't need to put it on mute. When we get to a dozen people, 10 or 12 people on the call, it's really annoying if people are talking or moving around or making noise or doing something when they're not on mute. So keep it on mute if you can. The next one is turn your television off, or at least turn the volume off. You can hear it everybody can hear it. So we want to get external noises out of that. Other than that, there are no really major rules. A disclaimer. This is time for a disclaimer. Some of you may not be familiar with studies that I've taught in the past. A lot of Bible studies are led by pastors who have been to seminary and have years of experience teaching on a particular topic. I am not a pastor. I have never been to seminary. I have no formal training in biblical study or teaching the Bible. I am not a biblical scholar. I cannot read Greek and I cannot read Hebrew. I've never published a paper that was reviewed by other scholars. So I am a layperson. I buy a book on a topic of the Bible and present the ideas in that book or commentary to the best of my ability. I generally won't read the book to you word for word. So you are getting my interpretation of the author's interpretation of what's going on in the Bible verses that we're studying. Now, that doesn't mean what I'm telling you is wrong or inaccurate. It just means that I don't necessarily know any more about this topic than you do. The difference is I read the book. I will be using 3 primary sources of commentary and a couple of other minor sources during the course of the study. I'll try to let you know what sources I am working with at any given time, but I may not always do that. I may also use some handouts. Usually they'll be available on the website. You can just click and open them, or I'll email them to you when I email the link to the web to Zoom session. There'll be a bibliography at the end of the class, and I'll try to keep you up to date on new sources as we go. We won't cover in detail every verse of the Bible, every book, every verse of Genesis. There's a lot more here than we can talk about in 16 sessions, and this is a 16-session class. And we won't discuss every little possible nuance. If I leave something out that you want to talk about, we can discuss it during the Zoom session. It is, as I said, it's a 16-session class. There's a schedule on the handout. We will normally meet once a week, but we may skip a week somewhere along the way. We should finish up around the middle of September. If the world opens back up before then, we may schedule some in-person meetings later in the schedule. So we begin. Why study the Bible, and why, more specifically, why study Genesis? What are our objectives? We begin with Bible study as revelation. That's why we generally study the Bible. We think of the Bible as one way in which God reveals knowledge of himself, his will, and his divine providence to the world of human beings. But why Genesis specifically? One, these are the foundational stories of the Hebrew religion, and therefore they are part of the basis of the Christian religion. Beyond the stories themselves, we're also going to take a larger view, and I've got 3 primary objectives. The first objective is the stories themselves are designed to teach us about God. They're designed to teach us about God's relationship with mankind, and by reading these stories, our hope is, as with all Bible study, our own relationship with God will be enriched. The second objective, quite often we read the Bible stories as though they were written to apply to our lives today. And we certainly can apply the lessons of Genesis to our life today. But our objective is to also hear those stories the way they were originally written. That doesn't mean we're going to learn ancient Hebrew. But how did the original listeners to these stories hear them, and what did they get out of them? This is admittedly an impossible task, but we will see how close we can get to it. Third objective, to look at how the authors, the editors, and redactors have created not just a series of stories, but a unified message about God and his relationship and his expectations and desires for the nation of Israel. So I'm going to use 3 primary modern translations and commentaries. The first one we've talked about already. I've already mentioned it. Robert Alter is an American professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught since 1967, so he's been there quite a while. He published his completed translation of the Hebrew Bible, the entire Old Testament, in December 2018. It comes in 3 volumes, the 5 books of Moses, which we're going to be looking at, the prophets and the writings. And it took, I don't know, 20 some odd years to write it. And he finished the Torah, the section we're going to start with, in 2004. The second one is one by Richard Elliott. Richard Elliott Friedman. This is the commentary on the Torah with a New English translation and Hebrew text by Richard Elliott Friedman. HarperCollins was the publisher, and this was published in 2001. So one of the interesting things about this is, one, it's written backwards, and we'll talk more about that later, but there's actual Hebrew in here. I don't know if you can read the Hebrew. I don't know if you can see the Hebrew. I don't know that you can read it. I can't read it. The third book is the 5 books of Moses. It's the Shokin Bible. This is by Everett Fox. And again, this is a commentary and a translation. And he uses a very interesting translation. It's going to be quite different than some of the other translations we've seen. There are 3 other minor sources that we'll be using. One is called Genesis, Procreation, The Politics of Identity by Mark G. Brett, Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman, and The Gifts of the Jews by Thomas Cahill. And there may be some other sources we use in addition to those, but those are the major sources. At this point, you're beginning to wonder if we are ever going to get to the book of Genesis. And we will, but I told you this was going to be a long introduction, so just hang on. We will get there. Alter, who is our primary source, the primary commentary that we're going to use, started with a discussion of the Bible in English and the heresy of translation. So the first thing that he talks about is, well, what is wrong with the other 30 or 40 or however many translations we already have that we need a new one? Alter says there's 2 things primarily to start out with. First is the difficulty of most current English translations. Modern translations have a shaky sense of English, and he says the King James Version has a shaky sense of Hebrew. He goes on to say that translation is always a betrayal. And if you think about it, translation is never exactly as the original because it's in a different language. It's somehow, we've had to change things in order to get to it. And by our we mean biblical scholars, our understanding of ancient Hebrew is considerably more nuanced and precise than it once was. The King James Version is the closest approach for English readers to the original, but the King James Version was written in the 17th century English, 400 years ago. We don't use the same language, same English language today that we used 400 years ago. It's similar, we can generally understand it, but it's not exactly the same. So he gives us an example of how modern translations have missed the mark. The first one he gives us is, there's a Hebrew word called spelled N-A-H-A-L, Nahal, which is most commonly indicates not any brook or creek or stream, but the kind of freshet called a wadi in both Arabic and modern Hebrew, that floods a dry desert gulch during the rainy months and vanishes in the heat of the summer. You may be familiar with the word wadi. It is a term in common English use. The best example I can think of something that I've seen similar to a wadi, if you've ever been to Palo Duro Canyon, which is near Amarillo, there's a stream running through that canyon, through the middle of the canyon. And there are times when that's full of water, and sometimes, generally during the middle of summer, when it's almost dried up. But there is water continually running through that stream. There is a rule in there, and a lot of camping is allowed inside Palo Duro Canyon, but they tell you you don't camp next to the stream, because when the rains come, and you can be set up with your tent it's really dry, but the rains come, and in about 3 or 4 minutes, that whole section close to that stream all fills up with water and it'll sweep your tin away. So you don't want to do that. That's not exactly a wadi because it doesn't dry up completely, but it's the same concept. So we have an example of the use of the Hebrew term nahal from the book of Job. This is from Job 6:15. Alter translates this phrase, this verse, as, "My brothers betrayed like a wadi, like the channel of brooks that run dry." The New International Version says, "But my brothers are undependable as intermittent streams, as the streams that overflow." The New Revised Standard Version, "My companions are treacherous like a torrent bed, like freshets that pass away." And the Common English Bible, CEB, "My companions are treacherous like a stream in the desert, like channels that overrun their stream beds." So Alter's point is that wadi is a perfectly good word. It's a direct translation of the word nahal. But translators should just translate the verse and not try to explain it. Explaining the story is the role of the commentary, not the role of the translator. Translators also have an often underdeveloped sense of literary diction, rhythm, and the use of figurative language. Too often they just try to explain a poem and not replicate it in English. An example, this is not from the Bible, you might notice. We can have a translation that says, "Poetry is not as beautiful as nature." And you can guess what that's a translation of. "I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree." They both have the same general sense, but they're telling the same story, but the diction and rhythm and the use of figurative language is not there. So Alter says the primary heresy of the use of translation is a vehicle for explaining the Bible instead of representing it in another language. Often this amounts to explaining away the Bible. Although he does say there's an exception being Everett Fox's translation. And again, these guys all know each other, I assume. Fox's translation is flawed only in that it's not quite English, and consequently it becomes a text for study rather than a fluently readable version that conveys the stylistic poise and power of the ancient Hebrew. Fox tries really hard to make it sound like Hebrew, which makes it not quite English. One more example, and then we're going to go on and talk about God. The Bible uses metaphorically extended body parts frequently that are ignored by recent translations. In place of hand, for example, translators often use power or control or responsibility, supposedly to add clarity. Where hand is a perfectly acceptable metaphor. So, for example, the original text may say the hand of God. The modern translation says the power of God. Well, we know what the hand of God means. It's a common type phrase, so why not just use hand of God? We're going to talk about the translating the names of God, because we have several different names of God used in Genesis. The first one we're going to talk about is what's called the Tetragrammaton, or Tetragrammaton. This is the name of God that we can't pronounce. And this is used in chapter 2. Most of chapter 2 will use the Tetragrammaton. The first example, an older example, is JHVH, which is articulated frequently as Jehovah. That's not used as common today as it was in the past. The more common version today is YHWH. Normally, modern scholars represent this as Yahweh, YAHWH. The original Hebrew texts only had consonants. That's why we have JHVH, no consonants in there. So vowels were added 1,000 years later when they did the Masoretic text. By that time, God's name was not to be spoken aloud by Jews. It had been revocalized to be pronounced as though it were Adonai, or Lord in English. Alter was not convinced that Yahweh is the correct original pronunciation and has avoided using YHWH in his translation because it can't be pronounced. And he uses the English term Lord in small uppercase letters to indicate that, like Adonai, it is an anomaly, a substitution for another name. And the same treatment is used in the King James Version. Fox uses WH or YHWH in his text. He also uses he in places where it's clearly referring to God. But Fox suggests that if readers are uncomfortable using he, perhaps because it implies masculine gender for God, just use God. So if you see he in Fox's translation, you can say God, that's okay. The second name for God is Elohim, Elohim. This is a plural in form and generally treated as singular. In our Bible, it's treated as meaning God. In the first chapter of Genesis, the term used is Elohim and translated as God in most of our texts, not necessarily all of them, most of our translations. But it's normally treated as generic, but maybe translated as God in lowercase God, which applies just normal everyday gods, not our God, not the God. The next one is El, which is borrowed from Canaanite, primarily used in poetry. Eloion is also borrowed from Canaanite, also used in poetry most frequently. And Shaddai, borrowed from Canaanite, primarily used in poetry. These are all names that are used for the God of Israel at different places in the book of Genesis and in the Torah, and also later on in other places in the Bible. And we may be familiar with the hymn El Shaddai, which is a combination of El and the Shaddai. Introduction to Genesis. We're actually going to get close. We're closer here. Alter begins by saying that Genesis is not strictly speaking a book, but rather an accretion of sundry traditions, shot through with disjunctions and contradictions and accumulated in an uneven editorial process over several centuries. Current biblical scholarship tells us that Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers specifically are weaved together from three different sources: J, E, and P. P, which is the priestly source, is used in chapter 1 of Genesis. J is used in most of chapter 2. So we will talk more about these in session 5, about these three sources. Alter doesn't spend a lot of time on these sources. Some of the other authors do, some of the other commentaries do, but Alter doesn't do a lot of that. Genesis is made up primarily of two large literary units. The first is the primeval history, which is chapter 1 through chapter 11, and the patriarchal tales, which is chapter 12 through 50. They differ in subject as well as style and perspective. The primeval history deals with the past, how it all started, beginning with the origins of life, the humankind, and the people of the earth. Chapter 12 begins with the story of the nation of Israel, with Abraham. It deals with eventualities, with the future. The primeval history dealt with origins, with the beginnings, with the past. The patriarchal tales deal with the future, with how things are going to turn out. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob invoke the future, not the past. God tells Abraham what he intends to do. Chapter 49, near the end of the book of Genesis, is a poem in which Jacob, on his deathbed, calls his sons together to tell them what is to happen to them in the days to come. The human actors in the primeval history are more generalized types than individualized characters. The characters are not quite human. There are lots of repetition and symmetries in the first 11 chapters. Those mostly go away in chapter 12, and we begin to see people who have feelings and relationships. We even see the complexity of feelings in the patriarchal tales. There's frustration and humiliation and indignation, and we don't see so much of that in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. What holds these two sections together is the outlook and theme. Abraham's family becomes the nation of Israel. And it's imagined as an effort to renew the act of creation. Here is creation of a great nation. And that's what we see in this second major section of Genesis. The creation story highlights be fruitful and multiply, and that's exactly what the family of Abraham does, and we'll see that phrase over and over again. This process is not easy for Abraham's family. At first it seemed like Abraham and Sarah couldn't have a son. The birthright of Isaac's sons became an issue. That Jacob's family was in danger of being wiped out by famine. Genesis begins with the creation of new life and ends with the image of Joseph in a coffin. A few comments before we start this is from Fox on the primeval history, the first section of the Bible, first major section of the Bible. God as creator is the primary principal theme of this first section. A total and uncompromised power of God as creator. God is introduced without any description of origin, sex, or limitation of power. God is the only functioning character in chapter 1. He faces no opposition and no resistance whatsoever. Secondly, there is an intrinsic order and balance of the created world. The 6 days of work plus a seventh for rest. 7 becomes a symbol for perfection that runs throughout the entire Bible. Humankind's key position in the scheme of creation is a major focus of the early part of the Old Testament, of Genesis specifically. Humankind has a role to play for God. So we're going to start. So pick up your Bible, and we're going to read. I'm going to start with reading Genesis, the first 3 verses of the first chapter of Genesis. When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So that's the first 3 verses. We look at this. The language in here, the Hebrew word for welter and waste that Alter uses is tahu wabahu, which Alter translate as welter and waste. Fox uses wild and waste. Friedman uses shapeless and formless. The Common English Bible says that means without shape or form. So tohu, the first Hebrew word in here, means emptiness or futility. While batu appears to be just what's called a nonce, which is not something I'm familiar with, but it's a word or expression coined for use on one occasion only, designed to rhyme with tohu and to reinforce it. So this is the only time this particular word is ever used in the Hebrew Bible. Wabahu. So Alter says the Hebrew word is tohu, or phrase is tohu wabahu, and these are his pronunciation guides. Different translators can translate these words differently, or the pronunciation, because we don't have an actual translation into English. This is actually obviously it's written in Hebrew, and we are reading this in a derivation of the Roman Latin alphabet, which has been turned into English, which is the English alphabet that we use now. So Friedman uses the terms tohu and bahu, which is bahu is not a common word. Like I said, it's a nonce. Fox uses tohu and vahu. But in general, the point here is that welter means a large number of items in no particular order, that it's just a confused mass. So what we're starting with is not nothing. It's not like God starts with 0 out there, but he's starting out with some kind of confused mass of things and puts them together and shapes them into some form. Let's go on to verse 4, and I'll read 4 through 8. And God saw the light, and that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And it was evening, and it was morning, first day. And God said, let there be a vault in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the water from water. And God made the vault, and it divided the water beneath the vault from the water above the vault. And so it was. And God called the vault heavens. And it was evening, and it was morning, second day. So a couple of things that we pick out of this. One is this is evening, the second day. Notice that Alter's translation does not say the first day. It says first day. There's no the there. The Hebrew doesn't use the word the in front of the day it is until the sixth day. So it's first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, the sixth day. Most of the English translations just stick the in there because it sounds better, I guess. But the Hebrew doesn't include that, so Alter left that out. Alter also uses the term vault here, which many current English translations use the term dome, which is much more common. The Hebrew term suggests a hammered out slab, not necessarily arched like a dome might be, but the dome was perhaps more poetic, if not very terribly accurate. So let's go on to the third and the fourth day. Verse 9 through 19. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered in one place, so that the dry land will appear. And so it was. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth grow grass, plants yielding seed of each kind, and trees bearing fruit of each kind, that has its seed within it upon the earth. And so it was. And the earth put forth grass, plants yielding seed, and trees bearing fruit of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening, and it was morning, third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault and for the heavens, to divide the day from the night. And they shall be signs for the fixed times, and for days and years. And they shall be lights in the vault of heavens, to light up the earth. And so it was. And God made the two great lights, the great light for the dominion of the day, and the small light for the dominion of the night, and the stars. And God placed them in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth, and to have dominion over day and night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening, and it was morning, fourth day. So we've created the sun and the stars and the moon. We've created light for the greater light for the day, lesser light for the evening, for the nighttime. God is dividing up the world, and this explains how so many parts of nature work in this process of creation. Let's go on to Genesis 20 through 26. And God said, let the waters swarm with a swarm of living creatures, and let the fowl fly over the earth across the vault of the heavens. And God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that crawls, which the water had swarmed forth of each kind, and the winged fowl of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, fill the water in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth. And it was evening, and it was morning, fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of each kind, cattle and crawling things, and wild beasts of each kind. And so it was. And God made wild beasts of each kind, and cattle of every kind, and all crawling things on the ground of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make a human in our image, by our likeness, to hold sway over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the heavens, and the cattle, and the wild beasts, and all the crawling things that crawl upon the earth. So, at this point, a couple of things I want to point out. One, the Alter uses wild beasts in here. It may be common to use wildlife or wild animals in the translation, the more common translation in verse 24. Alter says that beast of the earth would be a little bit more accurate. The Masoretic text reads all the earth. It doesn't even use the term beast, but that's the meaning is wild beast, so that's what Alter thinks he should use, and that's what he uses in here. Verse 26, the term human in verse 26 is Adam, the Hebrew term Adam. This is a generic term for human beings. It's not just a man. It's not a proper noun for Adam, the man. And it does not automatically suggest maleness. So if it has the prefix ben, B-E-N, meaning son of Adam, that would mean a man. So son of a man. The other line in here, rada, which means hold sway. A lot of times this is translated as rule or ruled over or dominion over. Dominion over is used in verse 16. In verse 26, it's hold sway. It just means to influence. It doesn't mean you dominate. It doesn't mean any absolute or fierce exercise or mastery. Verse 27. And God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This is kind of an interesting thing here. You see, we start with Adam, which, if you think of it as exclusively male, he's creating both male and female that we see down at the end of this verse. The term him in the second line, in the image of God, he created him. So this is not necessarily meaning him as a masculine him. Him, or the Hebrew word for him, is grammatically but not automatically masculine. So it could be a masculine term, but it's not automatically masculine, if that makes any sense. So one thing that we need to think about here, we could think about here, is could Adam be sexually undifferentiated until the fashioning of woman? If we have human being created, does it make any sense to have a man if you don't have a woman? If you don't have a male without a female, does that make any sense? So think about that. Maybe we'll talk about that on Wednesday. It would lead to some difficulties later on in the story if we didn't have that. You know, how do we get to the sexuality part? So 27 through 31. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and conquer it, and hold sway over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the heavens, and every beast that crawls upon the earth. Again, the term hold sway. And God said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth, and every tree that has fruit-bearing seed. Yours they will be for food. And to all beasts of the earth, and to all the fowl of the heavens, and to all that crawls on the earth, which has the breath of life in it, the green plants for food. And so it was. And God saw all that he had done, and look, it was very good. And it was evening, and it was morning, the sixth day. I guess this is the sixth day. One thing to point out here, again, this is the plants are to eat. The animals are not to eat. The human has sway or influence over the animals, but the animals aren't there to eat. The animals are there to eat the plants, and humans can eat the plants, but the humans don't eat the animals. So let's go on to chapter 2, and we're just going to read the first 4 verses of chapter 2 because this is really still part of the same story. Then the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their array. And God completed on the 7th day the task he had done, and he ceased on the 7th day from all the task he had done. And God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, for on it he had ceased from all his tasks that he had created to do. This is the tale of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So this is the end of the creation story, or the first creation story. We'll see a little bit different creation story next week when we go on with chapter 2. We'll also talk about Adam and Eve and and getting thrown out of the Garden of Eden and Cain and Abel and some other things. So we'll do the rest of chapter 2 through chapter 4 next week. One more point before we leave today. Everett Fox's had a point that I thought was important. He said that most of the cultural surrounding ancient Israel had elaborate creation stories telling about birth, sexuality, and the violent uprisings of the god. That is, it was God's doing battle that created things that made the earth what it is today. Israel's creation story argues against that type of beginning. Although Isaiah, Job, Psalms include traditions about violent conflict at creation, the Genesis story was simple and radical for its time, and it didn't show all these battles. It was different. Israel's story, creation story, is different than all the stories of the area surround the culture surrounding Israel. And here we end for today. So be safe. I hope to see you Wednesday.